on up. And with this music, you have to come like... Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so let me first just introduce you to the two wonderful people that we have here, and then I'll go on and introduce you to the two who are joining us online. I hope you'll be able to project them later. Okay. All right, so we have with us Vinji Sampao. Some of you might have already heard her talk on Thursday in a very inspiring discussion that she had earlier on. So Vinji is the Global Program Director at the Cartier Women's Initiative, and she's also the DEI Ambassador for Cartier International. Thank you, Vinji, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Lovely. And Dirk Lytton is one of our own. He's an INSEAD MBA alum, and he does many exciting things. But I always say that the one thing that stands out for us is he's the absolute role model for the perfect male ally. He's helped us. He's sponsored our research. He has, I think, gone beyond mentorship and sort of gone into the realm of active sponsorship, which is something that we consider very relevant. And among the other things you do, Dirk, there are many others, and their bios are out there. And if I start recounting everything that these wonderful people have achieved, it will take us through the whole 1 hour, so I won't go into that. I want to make sure to introduce now Professor Zoe Kinias. Zoe is Associate Professor for Organizational Behavior at INSEAD, and she led the project on this research that I shared with you. Welcome, Zoe. Good to have you with us. And we
Thanks,
Zoe. And we have with us Lucy Quist. Also one of our own, also an INSEAD alumna. She's on our board now. And Lucy is also Managing Director and Head of Change Leadership at Morgan Stanley. She's also the author of a book called The Bold New Normal. Wonderful to have you with us, Lucy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hello to everyone.
Okay. So let's start off, I think, by asking Zoe to give some feedback on the survey. Zoe, I've shared some of the highlights, some of the important highlights in terms of DEI, in terms of social impact of what came through the survey. So can you tell us what stood out for you? We had a lot of discussion in the room in terms of some of the aspects that stood out, some things that people were surprised by. What stood out for you? Was there anything that was surprising?
Thank you for asking, Vinika, and thank you for sharing the results with everyone before I was able to join. I appreciate. There are two things that stood out for me. The first one is the number of our alumni here, who lost their jobs due to budget cuts. And the thing that was surprising to me was not that women were losing jobs due to COVID, because we know that that has been documented in many other contexts and has been one of the negative implications of the disruption. But what surprised me about this was that these are women with master's degrees or higher. So these are very educated, very competent, very capable women. And so I was surprised that the impact was felt at that high level of achievement prior to the disruption. So that's the first point that had surprised me. And the second thing that surprised me might be a little bit of an artifact of how we asked the question, but I was interested that an equivalent number of men and women shared that they had been doing more emotional labor as a result of the disruption. So I was honestly anticipating that women would say that they had done more, because I had sort of been hearing that anecdotally from colleagues and had been the experience that I'd been hearing. But it is, I think, heartening for us to realize that men were doing a lot of the emotional work through this disruption as well.
Okay. And actually, that the first point you made came up in our discussions also, the fact that this was a survey with women in a very privileged position in many different ways. You know, the educational background, the fact that we had very senior respondents, and even in that group, we had this this sort of feedback. And so, how much worse is it at other levels? So, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Zoe, and the fact about emotional labor. I wanted to check any other any comments on the survey from our other panelists. Is there anything you wanted to add? I think we've already discussed some of these aspects, but if was there anything that stood out for you that we want to talk about, or maybe we continue with the discussions and come up with that? Okay. Lucy, coming to you now, you know, we've had a sort of 2-year gap in many ways in terms of almost taking a step back in terms of gender balance, which has been occasioned by this pandemic. And we've talked about some of the aspects where this disruption has been most problematic. What do you see as ways to sort of at least bring the situation back to where we were, if not improve upon it? And maybe give us examples from what is happening at Morgan Stanley that you feel has gone well, and you know, which we can then take up as possible best practices for us to follow.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting when you started out the question, you said going back to where we were. On a very personal level, I don't actually believe that we're on a journey back to where we were. We're on a journey to a new form of balance. So when you talk about, you know, what we have done as a firm, the most important thing on this journey has been around engagement. Engagement directly with women and with our colleagues, and engagement through surveys, information gathering, so that we're treating the whole transition as a program of work. And as you can imagine, we have a global footprint, which means that that program of work takes different forms in different countries, especially as the pandemic sort of wanes at a different rate in different places. And I say wanes and touch wood, because I really hope that we're on our way out finally. So a lot of that engagement has led us to a deeper understanding of what the experiences of many of our female colleagues have been over the last couple of years. And I know it goes without saying, it comes through surveys as well. Women have borne, it's interesting to hear that men feel that they've equally borne the same amount of sort of emotional burden. Women have definitely borne a lot more, at least from the studies we've looked at from McKinsey, the OECD, and so where women bore a greater share of the physical burden of caring, whether it's for young people, whether it's for people who are unwell, people in different situations, even people who are sick with COVID. So that information meant that we have had to be more flexible, especially as women, we transition back into the physical office, around the times and the days that people can actually come in, and really understand and support them in that journey. What we've also done is ensure that we've leveraged even much deeper our employee network groups, which are great places where different groups have a community of discussion that they can also take into their teams. So how are the employee network groups actually physically ensuring that the communication and the engagement that may be specific to their location is ensuring that the women's voices are heard? So I've talked about, you know, the return and how we're trying to create balance. I've talked about employee network groups. The other thing that we've done very strongly is lead from the front. So last week, for instance, I was in India for the week, and what we're doing is ensuring that we are going to where our women are, we're engaging them, spending time, but also bringing people together to really talk about how they are transitioning into the office, so that it doesn't feel like a singular journey. It doesn't feel like I'm doing this on my own, or I'm the only one faced with a unique situation. The communication is allowing women to understand, oh, my experience isn't 100% unique. There are these other colleagues, so collectively, I can have this conversation about my needs in this situation and not feel like the odd one out. So engage, communicate, be flexible, and very importantly, recognize that we're probably not going to land exactly where we used to be, but we hope if we work together, we will land in a good place where women can build their careers. And actually, one more thing I should add, and I personally advocate this, but we advocate it as a whole. I think it's really important that women, what we're seeing and what we believe for other firms is more broadly, is that women find a way to physically find themselves in the workplace at some point in the week. And I think this is really important for that connection. You don't want the workplace to actually become completely male-dominated because we're not physically present, and lose out on all the connections that take place when people meet in person. So very importantly, the end game should be that we're in the office, but it may not look exactly like what it used to.
Thank you. So the idea of engagement, of networking, of communicating, and then maintaining flexibility.
Yes.
But at the same time, even with flexibility, encouraging that presence, at least in order to ensure that people don't get excluded just because they're the ones who are not being physically present, right? Okay.
Yes.
Absolutely. And good to understand those points. And I think that's in line with some of the discussions that we were having in the group here earlier. So that's very useful. Thank you, Lucy. And actually now moving perhaps from that multinational sort of an environment, Vinji, to the women entrepreneurs that you work with at the Cartier Women's Initiative. And you and I have discussed earlier about the challenges that women entrepreneurs face in any case, and pre-pandemic, all the issues around funding and various other aspects. How have things changed for women entrepreneurs through this disruption, and how are they then handling this problem?
Yes, I think it's very relevant because for women entrepreneurs in general, they face what we call the triple burden. One is their business is smaller in size, and because they lack funding to scale up to grow. The second is that they tend to be in industries that are more cyclical in nature. And then the third is the childcare. And so, as you can imagine, during the pandemic, these three really hit home hard. That said, on the same token, when I look at the Women Impact Entrepreneurs as part of the Cartier Women Initiative program, the top 4 SDG goals that they work on are healthcare, education, gender equality, and decent work and economic development. So I think that captures everything that we were talking about today, right? And so we need women entrepreneurs to be represented because, as your survey found, that women leadership are also more focused on social leadership. And it's what we found as the common motivation for women entrepreneurs also. And so long way of saying that we really need more women to become entrepreneurs and to build impact businesses. And the main reason for that is also because we need women CEOs. And women CEOs will create the work environment that will be more gender balanced and will help, I think, resolve a lot of the challenges that women face at work. Because at the top level, we have someone who actually understands a lot what it means to be the different moments in life of a woman in building a business. I wanted to share an example with you because there's a woman impact entrepreneur that I've gotten to know very well over the years, over the last actually 10 years. I actually invested in her business very early on when she was just a very small business. And so Lisa Curtis is a woman impact entrepreneur, ex-Peace Corps volunteer that became a woman impact entrepreneur, hoping to empower a series of South Africa woman moringa farmer. She now has a moringa superfood business in the US. And during the pandemic, she had a baby. And so the challenges of motherhood and building a business really came very forefront in her mind. And so one might think she must be juggling a lot and trying to figure out how to run her business. And indeed, she was doing all of that. And she did remarkably well and weathered the storm of the pandemic incredibly, especially being in a cyclical business, in the food business, which is not easy, with perishable and etc. But all that, what was most incredible to me was that she decided to lead a series of research on pandemic and motherhood with 2 other women impact entrepreneurs. And so the 3 of them gathered a series of partners, fielded our survey among building motherhood during the pandemic, and revealed a whole series of insights about how women were losing work, very similar in many ways of the survey that you have fielded. And it was filled in the US, and it really led to a lot of insights on how women changemaker, women leadership, and women entrepreneurs really take action towards what they were seeing. And it was just really incredible. And to me, it was really moving that, actually in midst of all that she was facing, that she actually took the time to do this and did it in a coalition of other women CEOs who were in the same shoe.
Wonderful. And, you know, an example always brings the story home very closely. And so the aspect that you mentioned of triple whammy that these women face, and, you know, it's only all been exacerbated through the pandemic. But then there are these shining examples of women who've managed to rise above all of that. And that's certainly very interesting. Now, one of the aspects that came up very strongly in our survey, and you know, it also had a lot of attention and interest from our audience, was in terms of women then having to, you know, take on that extra burden, the domestic burden, childcare, elder care, the fact that when schools closed, it was the woman who, in many societal and domestic contexts, it was the woman who had to take on that extra burden. And men were able to depend more on their partners, their domestic partners, their spouses, to take on some of that extra domestic work. But in the case of women, it ended up with them having to take on paid support because they were not able to depend on their spouses in quite the same way, right? So Dirk, coming to you now, and you know, we've discussed in the past how important family support is. So how do you see the importance of support in the domestic environment, you know, from the spouse or other members of the family, in terms of how it will help as we get back into a more normal work environment as we're coming out of the pandemic?
Thank you, Vinika. So the dimension, the gender dimension, is coming out of the research as important, but I'd like to highlight another dimension that, at least in my country, in Belgium, was even more important. It was single-parent families versus dual-parent families. And the problem, the challenges for single-parent families, being a man or a woman, were exponentially more than for dual-parent families. So I have deep, you know, empathy with single-parent families, and you know, I'd just like to share that with you. It's not just a gender issue. What that has led us in many conversations to talk about is a dimension building on Lucy's point, with the companies about the equity component. There is good news. Many CEOs are ready to let happen in organizations conversations about gender equal education and the impact on the workplace. CEOs are ready to have these conversations taking place in their companies, which is already quite innovative. The equity dimension is where it really hits the ceiling. Because do you, as an organization, provide more support to a single-parent family or a heavily in need family versus a dual-parent family where it's more about culture, about dividing the tasks? We're in the middle of that discussion. Very practically, how much do you help? Because the good news was single-parent families, mostly women in Belgium, honestly, they were happy to be able to work from home. But then who was paying the connectivity? Who was paying the PC? Who was paying the furniture? That's where the debate is right now for the new world. So new contracts are being developed, employment contracts for home working, taking into account the difficulties of certain of the employees, which I think is great news. But the return to the new normal is one where we'll see distinctions emerging, not only based on gender, but there's a high link with gender. In my country, still, the big majority of single-parent families are moms with children, and so that's why it becomes a gender issue. Huh?
Indeed.
You know, can I just add to that really quickly? And thank you for that. I think the interesting thing that we are all learning is that for too long, we have focused a lot of our efforts when it comes to diversity and inclusion and equity on what is visible. So we've talked, you know, it's been narrowed down to, is it man or woman? Is it, you know, what race and so on? And that's all about visible diversity. But what you touch on there is the fact that a lot of our diversity as individuals is actually invisible, right? If the person doesn't tell you she's a single parent, or doesn't tell you her home situation, or doesn't tell you that they have a disability that's not visible physically, you don't know. And so this, I think what we've experienced is driving us to a world where I hope positively we will recognize the whole of the individual and seek to support all of that what they bring to the table that's different, rather than the things that we can readily see because, you know, we have eyes so we can see that they're a woman, they're Black, they're this, and so on. So I think that's a healthy conversation. It's a healthy place to be, to recognize much more than is it just a single parent or is it a woman in this case?
Absolutely, yes, and thank you for interjecting that point, Lucy. Very relevant. And in fact, one of the pointers that we were discussing earlier when we talked about the survey was that in many ways we have become much more aware of even the domestic nuances of our co-workers, of our employees. We're becoming aware of, for instance, who has a separate room that they can close the door off and just be quite private, and where is it a situation where the woman or man is working on the dining table and children will come in, and there will be those sorts of disruptions. And so we're more aware than we've ever been about the home context of our colleagues, of our fellow workers. But still, there are many aspects, as you pointed out, Lucy, that we still don't know about, and it's important to build that awareness and have that more nuanced approach. So thank you for that. And I will be coming to the audience for your questions, so keep them ready. And if there's something burning that's coming up and comments, by all means, raise your hands. Okay, we already have some comment, and I'm very happy to take that. We have a question from Grant. Can I request someone to go ahead? Okay.
Hello? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to make an observation. I think also something also came out in the pandemic. We got more normal social. So we actually found out what people's, by Zoom and all these meetings, all these interruptions, whether it was a cat or a dog or a budgie or children or a grandparent. So I think there was also a human aspect that actually also came, which was also one of those invisible things. So I think we saw the staff as normal with these situations. So that was also a positive, I thought, coming out of the pandemic.
Absolutely, yes. You're absolutely right, Grant. We started to realize that these are not just co-workers. These are human beings. They have their lives, and there's all sorts of other elements. Absolutely. And that's a good point. I mean, you realize that this person has a home life. There's a whole different dimension to the person that you're used to seeing, dressed very well and coming into office, but they have issues that we may not be familiar with. Yes, so the human aspect. So that's a positive, right? That's something that you consider that's almost a positive that's come out of this context. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else has something they'd like to share? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I used to work in a bank, in HR and diversity and mixity department. And I think I'm gonna be a bit provocative, but I think it's good sometimes.
Go ahead.
And I can say that I'm young, so it's okay. And I think that a lot of things that are put and that are thought within companies are like nice, but they don't really change like inequalities in gender problems. And I think that it's great to have like sensibilization, formation, like women networking and stuff like this. But if you don't tackle the problem from its roots, the change will take like so much time to really implement in organization and in women's life. And I feel like we don't take the problem directly, because it's scaring, like threatening maybe, like men, because because there's still like this very binary vision of women and men, like women, and as we saw this during the pandemic, because a lot of women were back to home, and their I would say basic role as moms and taking care of homes. And I feel like we should tell men, this is also your role. Like, it's not only like because we give birth to children, it's not because of this that you don't have like to take care of home, like domestic, I don't know, like cleaning house, like taking appointments for your children because they're sick. And I feel like if we shared this mental charge and about like children and domestic things and problems, I think it will change the whole vision of life in general, and also especially in companies, because we wouldn't have like to speak about like women leadership and stuff like this. It would be like natural, you know, to have like an equality between the genders.
Okay, thank you for that. So the idea of building... Sorry, yes, yeah, I'll come to you in a minute, Lucy. So just, yeah, the idea of having this gender balancing foundation starting with its origins in the home, right? And then the fact that, as we were discussing earlier, that makes it that much easier for the woman then to be more productive in the workplace, right? Absolutely. Thank you for that comment. I think, Lucy, you wanted to interject at that point. Go ahead.
Very, very briefly, and sorry for interrupting you. I think the point you've made, Vinica, is absolutely right. Some of these things are definitely a family's responsibility to choose. But I just wanted to address the point made around banks. I think in financial services very broadly, the change is being recognized. I'm not an HR professional. I'm an engineer. I've worked in telco. I've never actually worked in HR. So there's a recognition that this is a business imperative, which we could spend a whole hour on explaining. But I just wanted to assure, put out the message that the recognition is there that now we actually need to treat this the same way we treat other business deliverables if we really want to see it change. I'm not claiming it's all perfect, but the recognition the point that was being made is very, very true. If you treat it as something that, eventually we'll get to or it will happen, it doesn't happen. You have to force it and you have to hold people accountable, just like any other business deliverable.
Absolutely. And Lucy, that's a good point for me to have a follow-up question to you, actually, in terms of exactly this, building that accountability. The fact that, as you said, what gets measured gets done, and only if you're held accountable are you going to go ahead and actually make something happen. So continue on what you were saying and tell us a little bit more about how do we then build a DEI accountable organization, especially coming from the banking environment, which has not necessarily had the best reputation in that area in the past. So how do we go about doing this?
Yeah, and look, I'll try and make this really succinct because we've been very intentional. So in July of 2020, after everything that was happening in the US, it was actually a topic in our quarterly earnings call where our CEO said that, we wanted our workforce, I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, we wanted our workforce to look like the communities and societies in which we live and work. Well, what that then means is that you have a different mix of what it means to have a diverse workforce and to work on the inclusion of that workforce by location, right? So that then gives you a problem statement that makes it very clear of what you're solving for. That's number one. So what we did actually is we took the time to understand our locations even better. We actually went ahead and set objectives. And these objectives were then distributed across the businesses at the most senior level to then trickle down. And it's not just set and then trickle down and nice to have. We actually established accountability as our first DEI pillar. It's actually a pillar, and those responsibilities or the accountability was assigned to the same people who make decisions about the organization, whether it's hiring, whatever it is. Decision makers own it. It's not HR. The actual people in the businesses across the business own those objectives. And I think the other thing we've done, which is quite remarkable and unique, is that we set up the Institute for Inclusion, which very specifically focuses on all things DEI. And 2 years in a row, we've publicly published our report. And, it's a publicly available document. Anyone can read it. It doesn't say that everything is perfect. it talks about what we're doing, how things are moving forward, what more we need to do. So that sort of accountability is not just internal, but the fact that we put out a public report is also in some ways in our position impacting societies, because again, if a company reads it or a community reads it, like, okay, this firm is looking at this, maybe I should think more about these things. So the accountability is absolutely key, and it's treated the same way as, you know, the deliverables of the projects and the investments for the year. You also have to deliver on your DEI objectives so that we know how we're moving forward. And then it informs the conversation of all the other pillars, which are around advancement of careers, representation around culture, around recruitment, and also creating a more inclusive culture. So you have to be very intentional about it.
Okay, so being very intentional, creating objectives, clear objectives, disclosure, as you said, of the good things and the bad things, what's working and what's not working, and of course accountability. So very important points there. And I want to mention, I was very happy to see an example of this being done very well with the bank. I won't take the name of the bank, but this is someone I met over breakfast last month, and this was a senior banker who was visiting Singapore from Europe, and he told me, and he was not exactly not you, Dirk, and not always the ultimate male ally, but someone who understood these issues, and he told me, I don't have a choice anymore, Vinika, because it's been made part of my KPIs. And that to me was really, to every point that Lucy made, it's made someone accountable, it's been made part of his deliverables, and if it doesn't happen, then his bonus is going to suffer. So that's, if these are the actions that need to be taken, just to, put our money where our mouth is. So thank you for sharing that, Lucy. Any other burning questions from the audience at this point, or comments? Anything you disagree? Yes, Vinji, go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to echo Lucy's comment around accountability, because also at Cartier, for us, our CEO, Sir Vignon, has also committed us as first-class maison, which is our objective of being first class in what we do. And as part of that, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's part of those goals. And how that funnels down is also that we're committed to the UN Women Empowerment Principle. We have signed the Equal Pay Certification, and he himself has acted as a role model, like Ilan, the Dean of INSEAD, as a he for she. And so for us, I think the accountability is really important, and as corporates, and those of you who work at corporates should go back to your companies and encourage them about these ways to take action.
Absolutely. Yes, another example. Any comments from the audience on that? I thought I saw someone. Okay, we'll come back as we go along. Okay, absolutely. Thank you, Vinji. And, it's very important to set these examples, as you said. Zoe, coming to you now, we have a number of our MBAs in the audience. I don't know if you can see them, but, so in this business school environment that you and I work with, and many of our, students and colleagues are in the audience, do we have a special responsibility here in terms of, trying to counteract some of this disruption that we've seen with regard to gender balance? Do we have a special responsibility as developers and educators of the business leaders of tomorrow? What do you think?
Thank you. Thank you for asking, Vinika. I would say that we have a very strong responsibility. It's also an opportunity, but I do agree with you that it's a responsibility. And the way I see this is that there are two things that we fundamentally should be doing. The first one is to ensure that we are creating an environment in which we can develop future female business leaders. Because if they're not able to come in and learn with us and from us, then that is a problem for the future of the talent pipeline that sometimes gets noticed as being a challenge, although nowadays we have many, many very qualified women going through our program. So that's one that I think we've made good progress on. The other thing that we need to be doing, which connects with what Dirk and others have talked about with male allyship today, is that it is our responsibility also to be educating current and future business leaders, both male and female, on how to lead inclusively and how to develop gender balance as business leaders. And this also connects with what Lucy was just sharing about introducing KPIs that are diversity related is one of those things that people don't always think to do. organizations and leaders also tend to think of diversity initiatives as being something that's separate from change initiatives, oddly. I mean, fundamentally, these are change initiatives. And so sharing these insights that we know both from connecting with the business leaders that we work with and also from the research that we conduct and that we read as academics, I think is very, very important. And so it's about educating women and also educating business leaders with respect to both. And there are lots of things that we can do. I mean, when we get into the details of this, I was just in New York this week, connecting with faculty members from Columbia Business School, Harvard Business School, London Business School, MIT, Stanford, all these folks. And we started this conference in 2019 to talk about how do we do this as educators. And there are some things that we know are very important to do. We need to diversify the case protagonists that we're teaching in class. We need to have more diverse faculty members. We need to share the insights that we know from research that can help to build inclusive cultures, et cetera. So we know there's a lot of work to do, and we see this both as a responsibility, as you said, Vinica, and also really as an opportunity, because when we think about the impact that we have as business educators, there's the immediate impact that we have on the thousands of students and executive participants that we come in contact on an annual basis. But then there's also the impact that each of those leaders has currently and in the future. So when Vinica shared the demographics of how senior our alumni are in their organizations, these are people who are very influential as business leaders. And so if we think about how to ensure that they are being the best leaders with respect to equity, diversity, and inclusion, then that means that we can have much more impact than just within our own classrooms. So that's where I start to get really excited. Thanks for asking, Vinica.
Absolutely, thank you. And yeah, building responsible leaders who will, as you said, Zoe, lead with inclusion and, you know, make that happen in their organizations. It's a very important part of this whole conversation. And I see our MBAs nodding actively. You guys are the future and will be leading this in your own organization. So we certainly hope to see you be part of that change. And it's great to have you here with us. Now, Zoe, talked a little bit about male allyship and the role that men play in this. And of course, we're all very aware of the fact that this is a problem that is not encountered just by one gender. All genders have to move along with us and sort of work together on building more gender balance. So coming to you, Dirk, how do you see the role of men evolving in this journey? I mean, I've started to hear this thing about champion fatigue and ally fatigue. I've been doing this for so long. I'm doing the best I can. And now, is it really still important? So how do you see the role for men evolving in terms of continuing to support gender balance?
Well, the role, I'm talking business leaders, so I talk to other men, senior male leaders, and there are some messages that I'd like to share. Many of them are telling me, look, Dirk, it has to start from the top. I realize inclusive leadership, what you're talking about, essential for making everybody develop in the best version of themselves, but I don't know how to be a good inclusive leader. And so, first of all, what I notice, it's a journey of top management where in the beginning they're unaware. Many of them are still unaware about what it really is to be discriminated, to not understand individual needs. They're unaware. And then they become aware and they're in panic because they're unskilled. They don't know what to do. They feel threatened. Why should I change? Help me, please. Dirk, how should I change? And then they become a little more skilled, and some of them are naturally a little more skilled. So my first is, you are all in organizations, allow your leaders a journey. They're good people, but they also need to learn. That's one message. Now, what typically happens is, how do I get them excited about this thing? And I can go two ways. I can go very personal. And I ask them, do you have a daughter? And if the answer is yes, what do you do as a father to make your daughter have the same opportunities as your sons? It's a very personal question. Leadership of tomorrow has to demonstrate walking the talk. So better start at home, supporting your daughters, telling your daughters what she will probably face how she can react and how she can become a role model for her colleagues and maybe even for her bosses. So if that question doesn't work, I go to a second question. I say, have you clearly said to your organization that you stand for zero tolerance policy? Have you clearly said that? Oh, it's written by HR somewhere. No. You have to say it to your organization. In my company, in my bank, there is a zero tolerance for any form of aggression, mental or moral, or discrimination. Say it. You would be surprised how many top managers have a hard time saying this publicly because they've never witnessed it. They have no diverse person in their family. They've never been experiencing it. So I think you should be patient to having say it. So if they say, okay, Dirk, now you're making me say this. Yeah, let's get it said. Let's get it out. Oh, and my team, yeah, the whole management team has to be able to say it and do it. And then comes the third part, which is to say, okay, you agree that talent has no gender or no diversity aspects, and they generally agree. And I say, so 50% of population is women, 50% is men. If they're equally talented, how come you don't have an equilibrated organization? You are not doing your job. You don't have the best talent. Oh, and some other managers are much smarter. They pick the talent that has been abandoned by others and integrate it into the organization. It becomes a talent development discussion. Not in HR, by the way. It's not HR. And then there are 6 points, and Lucy has already mentioned one of them. Lucy, I 100% agree about measuring, but there are 6 dimensions we talk about many times. One is about unconscious bias, because at the end of the day, it has to be addressed. And every manager has to understand what his bias is. I did the IAT test. We should all do the implicit association test. Second area is measuring. Lucy, I'm 100% with you. Accountability. The third one is about leadership, inclusive leadership capabilities. The fourth one is about going deep into the organization, having a bottom-up and top-down approach at the same time. So the CEO should ask, in my business, I'm in retail, at the cash, the person at the till. When I walk, I ask the person at the till, how are you doing? Are we supporting you from the top to the bottom? How many CEOs have the courage to talk needs with the lowest levels in their organization? Have you spent time on this? That's area 4. Area 5 is celebration. Too few organizations celebrate diversity and inclusion success. We do a little bit, but not enough. And the last one actually is about the CEO or the leader himself. And that's a hard journey. And I only repeat what I said before. Give them some time. And the hottest way to do it, you as youngsters, they love to listen to you. You are their best teachers. So the most advanced companies are putting reverse mentoring into action.
Yes.
Which is that mentees can mentor their leaders on becoming more inclusive leaders.
Absolutely. Lucy, did you want to comment on something there?
No, I was just nodding and agreeing because many of the things that Dirk highlighted are things that we have had the opportunity to do and take feedback on in the last couple of years. And I couldn't agree more, every single one of those things. And the interesting thing, particularly with reverse mentoring, Dirk, is that I remember being on a similar panel at INSEAD. It was way back in probably 2018 when we had this conversation. So we're kind of ahead of our time, she says, as an INSEADer who is biased in INSEAD's favor. And we talked about some of these things, and including this point about reverse mentoring. I was in a different firm at the time, and we talked about it. And it had been a very powerful tool at that time. And again, in rolling it out where I find my, and back then I was in telecoms, now in financial services. Again, we've done the same thing. and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, because you can both be in the firm for a long time. You know, that's one comment I get. People say, but she's been in the firm almost as long as I have, but she's had a completely different experience. I didn't know this. I didn't realize this. Or you can meet someone more junior who's also having a different experience. And Dirk, I think for me, the one point that I would add, which you've touched on, but it's something I'm beginning to nudge people on, is that I actually feel some leaders actually need coaches on DEI. So they're going to do all this reverse mentoring. They're going to get the the bias training, the inclusive leadership training. Sometimes they need a safe person like yourself to talk to and guide them through this journey, the same way we'd give them a coach for when they get a new big job. And I don't think we're doing enough of this. This, I think, is a new area of opportunity. There's some leaders actually need a coach to guide them, because like you say, the intent in most cases is great and positive. They just sometimes don't know where to start or what to do or how to even carry themselves differently from a script that has told them that you're supposed to be, alpha, do this, and suddenly they're supposed to be inclusive and all these other things. It can really mess with the head sometimes.
True.
If I could,
please go ahead.
Do you mind if I tag in too? I'm just getting a little excited by what both Dirk and Lucy have both shared. And something that really stood out for me in what you were both sharing is that this is a learning journey for our business leaders. And that's something that I can't emphasize enough. It's a learning journey for everyone within our businesses, but our business leaders in some ways might be relatively disadvantaged in contrast with our younger employees. And one thing that we were talking about at this conference I mentioned earlier this week is that the conversation about diversity in business really didn't start until the 80s. And even then, it was just sort of starting to percolate, and it has exploded in the last 5 years. But up to that point, there was so little going on. We were talking a lot about common ground and sharing views on things rather than really celebrating our diversity and learning from each other. And as experts, it's an exciting time to be researching in this space because there's still so much more that we don't even know as experts. There isn't anyone who has this all figured out. And so normalizing the fact that this is a learning journey for us is something that I think can help across levels. And I also wanted to underscore Lucy's suggestion with the coaches. That's something that also came up in our conversations. We assign coaching for lots of other things that are important. And sometimes those leadership coaches can be good for this skill development and this empathy development as well. And sometimes we need to get specialized coaches who have a little more expertise than the leadership coach that our leaders would otherwise be working with. So to think about that in a mindful way to make sure that they are getting a safe processing space to develop and learn and to grow in this space, I think is very important. So wanted to underscore. Thanks.
Wonderful, yes. So the idea that, even as a leader, you're on a continuous learning journey, and to have the humility to accept that is crucial. And I really love the point about coaching leaders for this added dimension, which is something that, we're beginning to talk about now, but certainly wasn't something that was typically thought about when we talked about coaches for leaders. So that's excellent. And in terms of action points for change now, I think there we have something really interesting that we can take back to our organizations. Wonderful. Vinji, I want to come back to you. You work with this amazing group of fellows at Cartier Women's Initiative, where you recognize these women impact entrepreneurs and some of these exciting things they do. But besides that, you also have your role as an ambassador of DEI at Cartier. So what have you as an organization perhaps learned from the lessons that you're learning? And again, you're talking about reverse mentoring, learning constantly. What are the lessons that as an organization you're learning from these inspiring women that you work with and learn from?
Sure, yeah. I would say it's two big things. Especially during the pandemic, for us as a Maison to learn from the women impact entrepreneurs that has been part of our program has been this act of resilience during this time. And just so many of our fellows business were under just very difficult conditions, just like many businesses. And yet with less resources, less means, childcare, babies, everything, they still weather through it and they still find a way. And that has been a really true source of inspiration for Cartier internally on how to navigate through the pandemic in many ways. But also, I would say this idea then also reinforced the importance of women as part of leadership and all of that. So that I would say the resilience part, it was the first thing. And the second is around, I would say, purposeful leadership. For us, I think our CEO Cyril is someone that is a very conscious leader. You know, we have corporate commitments on key areas that Cartier genuinely cares very much around as part of our DNA. And Cartier Women Initiative is one of those commitments. And for us, this is about purposeful leadership, about practicing the change that we want to see in the world. So yeah, I would say those are the two things that we have gone as a big source of inspiration of having women as part of leadership and inspiring us.
I love that. Purposeful leadership. Certainly that's something that we can all learn from. Thank you for sharing that. Any questions in the audience right now? Do we have anyone? Yes, go ahead, please. We need a mic here. Thank you. Oh, no, yeah. Do we have another mic? That one's not working. Try again. I think it might work. Yes.
Testing. Okay, here we go. I think a word that was just said once and not enough was empathy. And I think it's crucial and a key factor for leaders to have empathy towards their employees, to understand what they're going through for diversity, for equity, for inclusion. And as we mentioned, for employees to have then empathy towards their leaders on their journey. And so my question is, how can we teach empathy, and is it possible?
Can we teach empathy? Great question, and Zoe's both thumbs up, so go ahead and tell us more about how we can do that, Zoe.
Thank you for that question. It's I don't know if you all are familiar with Carol Dweck's work. She's an educational psychologist at Stanford University who wrote a book on growth mindset. And it's this idea that we can develop with respect to just about anything. It's based on core neuroscience. Until we leave the earth, we are able to learn new things. So empathy definitely can be grown. You might also be asking sort of, how do we help develop this? So trying to listen to other people share about their experiences and listen truly from their perspective, putting aside our own prejudgments and our own assumptions and our own experiences even, is a good way to practice this interpersonally. But we can also develop our empathy by doing things like reading fiction. There's these great research studies showing that reading literature can help us to develop our empathy because it gives us a rich and deep understanding of someone else's lived experience. And there are other things like this. We can also think about this. If we're reading literature, we can also focus our attention on reading literature from the perspectives of people from different backgrounds to our own. Can be sort of the amped up version of that. But there are lots of things that we can do to develop empathy, and being intentional about that and saying, I want to strive to do it can be a first step. I'm so glad you asked.
So I thank you, Zoe, to build on that question. I remember being together with a number of leaders in a session on talking empathy. And actually what we were asked to do was to preside a meeting with two people, an interview. And then we were seeing our own interview back. And they asked us, who do you think, you or this other interview, has the most empathy? And then there were little tricks, like they said, are you curious by nature? Are you asking questions? People who are very empathetic tend to ask more questions than telling things. So, hey, by the way, you asked a question. My question to you would be, how can I help you to move forward in life? Instead of, I think you should do this. So there are a lot of techniques to build on Zoe's point, to learn, to be a little bit more empathetic. Now, there's a technical side to it. And then there is this strange, because empathy includes a capacity to really deeply put yourself in the shoes of somebody else. The test for that is many times, are you doing anything in your life that is showing your generosity? Sometimes leaders are not very generous, honestly. It's all about power and results. But what is the true generosity they sometimes have? So in INSEAD, we have, as an alumnus, I'm very much in favor of the portfolio approach. What do you do with your life? And my recommendation to all of you as future leaders is please do plan for some voluntary work in a very social area, where you use your leadership skills. It increases your empathy capabilities. You just feel differently.
We have a comment here in the audience.
Thanks. Good question. I think this one makes everybody react and feel that they have to say something. To connect to other conversation we've had here at Change Now, 2 points. One is the role of art. Here. Zoe, you mentioned literature and reading. We had some conversation and some showcasing yesterday, no, it was 2 days ago maybe, of the role of art and using art as a way to cultivate empathy and to build connections. And also as a way to grow your mind. And the second point I wanted to mention is the role of nature. Being close to nature, that also has been demonstrated as also building empathy. So of course there is a connection among us human beings, but also with other living species, and part of nature I think has also been demonstrated as being important to grow empathy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, do you have a follow-up on that? And what a wonderful question you asked. It's raised so many thoughts in all of our minds.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Amazing feedback here. And my follow-up is, how do we make people who need to hear that the most hear it? Because I think it's fair, all of us that are here want to have empathy, want to develop it, but then there are a lot of people that don't have that inspiration. How do we inspire them to take these actionable points?
Absolutely. And the concern is always, if you're asking a question like this, you're already part of the choir, you believe, and everyone else who's reacting to this believes, and yeah. So a very important point about how do we take this to the people who are not going to voluntarily look at art or read books or put themselves in the role play situations you talked about, Dirk, and take it beyond that. So Zoe, do you have any follow-ups on that from the research that we were talking about earlier?
So I can share more from our practice as educators. We do sometimes get companies who send employees and leaders to us to develop these kinds of skills. These are leadership development programs. We can do some of this in our MBA programs, and we had a little conversation about the problem people in classes, the people who really need that kind of coaching this week. And one of our peer institutions is doing an initiative that I thought was just fascinating, of offering free coaching, free leadership coaching for those people who need to develop their empathy, because they may not understand from the course material that empathy is a core aspect of leadership. And of course, it's disproportionately important when we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, but it's important as a leadership skill for everyone. And so helping people to recognize that and to practice that, and we can do that at a corporate level, and we as educators can do that in our own pedagogy and within our classrooms and as educational institutions as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Very interesting train of thought in terms of, just talking about empathy. Great question. So I have time for, I think, perhaps a couple more questions. Let's take one from the audience. Go ahead.
So it's a small comment to react on the discussion. So I'm an engineer. I've been working for 7 years in the aviation sector. And so to this comment on empathy, I know that so on the HR selection process, there are new means, for example, using virtual reality. These are really means that are currently used in certain sector to really put the candidate into a virtual situation that can show empathy, or that can put the candidate in in certain cases to assess some particularities. So it's also, I think, a way to answer. So there is the coaching part that you mentioned, the leadership development that you mentioned. There is also on the selection process, I think that it's going to be more and more common to assess that. And I think it's an opportunity also.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and virtual reality is certainly something that we're hearing more and more in this context, and we're exploring that at INSEAD too, in the work that we're doing. So great, thank you for that. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Okay. While you're thinking of that, I'll take one more that was on my list. So a conversation that we had earlier, Lucy, was about this whole idea of the Great Resignation, continuing, maybe albeit at a smaller pace than before, but maybe the idea that it's not just the Great Resignation, it's this great reimagination. The fact that the pandemic sort of gave us time to step off the treadmill and just sort of reflect on what do we really want from our work, and are we really doing what we want to do for the rest of our lives, and the ramifications of that. So how do you see this playing out? Is this a trend that's going to continue? What do you think is going to happen in the post-pandemic or maybe pandemic normal world that we are moving into now?
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you. And no, I don't think the idea of a Great Resignation is even sustainable. I don't think people continue, and it is slowing down. And I think part of it is because of the point I made around sustainability, but I don't want the fact that I believe it's not sustainable and it won't stick to mean that we shouldn't learn the lessons. So it's really important that we ask ourselves why we went through this phase of a very extreme, sudden sort of great resignation. What are we going to learn from it? And how do we actually support people? Because I think what's really going, the more sustainable pace is what you characterize as, reimagining. So I think a lot of resignations were, to some extent, reactionary to the point of what do I want to do to with my life, but also in some cases it was due to genuine pressure. Many of the pressures we've discussed today already, so I won't go over them any longer, where the individual feels, well, I'm sorry, something has to give, and I can't give up my family, I can't give up this, I can't give up that. Then maybe it's a job. And I actually heard one case where the woman was a medical doctor, right? Much more qualified than her husband, who worked in HR. But she's like, I can't do this any longer. And when he told me this story, I was so surprised. But again, she's a professional on a great career trajectory that she's chosen, but she's like, I can't do this any longer. So first of all, we need to learn the lessons. People were quitting for very clear reasons. Even if I call it reactionary, it was very well thought through, in the sense that they thought that that's the best way to rebalance their life. So a big lesson there is, people want more balance in their lives, and they want to feel that their work life is more purposeful. They want to feel that the career they're on is the career that they want to do. So what I encourage a lot of firms to think about is, especially if you're a large organization like we are, that you do have a real opportunity to provide mobility for people. When I say mobility, I mean the opportunity to change career in the same organization, or change location in the same organization. That kind of opportunity, which could be that the person has been following one path and they realize that this may not be the path I really want, or I want to try something new within a different career, is something that we should create more intentional opportunities for this to happen in a structured way, rather than it being, I know so-and-so, so, in their department, that's the only opportunity. So we need to be intentional about it. We need to recognize, and I'm going to focus this one more on women, even though I know DEI is much broader than that. If I look at even my own career, many women in this room will relate. Our priorities shift over time. So the priority of what really matters to maybe a woman who's just left university or has early career, versus a mother, versus someone who's more mature, she's experiencing different things in life, and so on and so forth. They all change, which means that as employers, that mobility and flexibility that I described actually is going to evolve over time. So we're not going to solve it one more time. So I think I'll wrap this all up in a bow that says, we've talked about empathy, we've talked about growth mindset, we've talked about approaches. We need to recognize that our new normal is an evolving world where we've got to appreciate the human being, that their priorities are going to change over time. We don't want anyone to mass exodus leave their employment, because we all want to be gainfully employed. So how do we as companies become more flexible to recognize that life is going to change over time? And not just a handful of people having access to these things, but as many as want to participate in the opportunity to rebalance their life, take a step back sometimes, step back in more fully, move jobs completely. We should be open to this and not be overly prescriptive.
Wonderful. And I think the idea that, so the pandemic has also provided this opportunity then, as you were saying, Lucy, for organizations to take a step back, to see what we can change as big companies or small ones. What are some things that we need to be doing different? What are some changes that were a long time coming and perhaps have been forced upon us a little bit by the pandemic? And so, we take advantage of that. Anyway, we've spoken about everything from empathy to accountability to disclosure to reverse mentoring to flexibility, some fantastic insights there. And I think I've learned a lot. I hope all of you in the audience have too. And I do want to thank everyone who's present here and our online audience for having been really engaged and having shared your thoughts openly. You've complained, you've made suggestions, and you've given us some action points to think about. A big thank you to our panelists, to Zoe and Lucy for joining us from Singapore and UK, respectively, and to Dirk and Vinji for being here with us in person. And to all of you, once again, a big thank you for your presence and for your open and candid sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Before everybody goes, I just wanted to make a very special thank you to Vinika, who's been our host today, presenting everything. Thank you very much. You did a fantastic job in engaging us all. And I also wanted to thank my team. I want them to stand up. As you all here only have spotlights, I want them to come on stage. That's our chance to take a team picture. Behind every good work, there is a team. Come on, Tabiana. We have also the students who've helped us. Come on and come here, let's take a team picture. I'm going to ask you to applaud them because they're doing fantastic work on this issue and others. And I just wanted to close by saying that, yes, another conversation on gender. The data has shown you that, unfortunately, yes, we need to have one more and many more. We've also shown you that focusing just on gender and on the privilege in the business piece, we still have work to do. So whatever happens to others, we need to be mindful of that. And I think we also want you to leave you with a message that this is not about women, okay? This is about change in organizations. So this is why we think that bringing that topic to change now is actually a key topic. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to all these people. Come on, guys, come on up. Yes, come on up. Enjoy the rest of your weekend while we take our group pictures. Thank you very much.